The word penitentiary did not exist before this building. Think about that for a second. We use the word so casually now. Penitentiary, penitent, penitence. But someone had to invent it. Someone had to sit down with a blank piece of paper and decide that a prison needed a new name because it was going to do something no prison had ever attempted. The word comes from the Latin pianitere, to feel regret, to be sorry, to repent. The people who built Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia believed, and I mean believe the way you believe in something that keeps you up at night, the way you believe in something you'd stake your reputation on. They believed that if you put a man alone in a room with nothing but silence and a Bible and the faint warmth of a skylight above him, he would eventually look inward. He would face whatever he had done. And he would come out the other side remade. They called it the Pennsylvania system. The rest of the world called it an experiment. By 1842, Charles Dickens called it something else entirely. Here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. The men who built this place were not monsters. That's the easy story, and it's wrong. They were Quakers. They were abolitionists. They were prison reformers who had watched men be flogged in public squares, branded with hot irons, their ears nailed to posts, and they were sickened by it. Eastern State was their answer to brutality, their alternative to pain. The road into that building was paved with genuine compassion, and 80,000 Americans are still walking it. Philadelphia, October 1829. The city smells like coal smoke and horse and the faint rot of the Delaware River at low tide. The building that will become Eastern State Penitentiary has just been completed on what was then the northern edge of the city, out on Fairmount, where the land was still farmland in patches, and you could hear wind moving through the last of the season's dry corn. The architect was John Haviland, a British-born designer who had studied Gothic churches and knew something about what a building could make a man feel. He designed Eastern State to look like a medieval fortress. The castellated towers, the 30-foot granite walls, the enormous arched entrance that would make anyone walking through it feel very, very small. The building cost $780,000. In 1829, that is roughly $25 million in today's money, and it made Eastern State the most expensive building in the United States at the time. More expensive than the Capitol, more expensive than any courthouse, any bank, any private estate. The state of Pennsylvania spent more money on a prison than on anything else it had ever built. That fact alone tells you how seriously they were taking this idea. The design was a wagon wheel. 7 cell blocks radiating outward from a central surveillance rotunda, so that a single guard standing in the hub could see down every spoke at once. Jeremy Bentham had theorized this design. He called it the panopticon, the all-seeing place. But Eastern State was the first institution in the world to actually build it at scale. Each cell block was its own corridor. Each corridor held individual cells. Each cell was, by the standards of 1829, almost luxurious. 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, 10 feet high. A heating pipe ran through the wall. A flush toilet, which most Philadelphia homes did not yet have. A small exercise yard attached to the back, private, walled, so that each prisoner could go outside without ever seeing another human being. And above each cell, cut into the barrel vault ceiling, a single circular skylight, 9 inches in diameter. They called it the Eye of God. Light fell from it in a single shaft, straight down, illuminating nothing except the floor of the cell and whatever the prisoner was doing on it. It wasn't decorative, it was theological. The architects and the Quaker reformers who commissioned the building wanted the prisoner to feel watched, not by a guard, not by a magistrate, but by something that couldn't be bribed or reasoned with or appealed to. God was the warden. The skylight was the surveillance camera. Beautiful idea, if you don't think too hard about what it's like to be the man on the floor. His name was Charles Williams. He was the first prisoner admitted to Eastern State Penitentiary on October 25, 1829. Prisoner number 1, recorded in the intake ledger in a clerk's careful copperplate as a light Negro man, which is the language the ledger uses, and I'm not going to clean that up because the language matters. It tells you something about who was considered expendable enough to be experimented on first. Williams was a farmer from Delaware County, Pennsylvania, 29 years old. He had a scar above his left eyebrow from a farming accident sometime in his teens, a detail that surfaces in a physical description recorded at intake alongside his height, 5 feet 7 inches, and his crime, burglary of a house. He had stolen a watch, a $20 bill, and a gold seal. He was sentenced to 2 years in solitary confinement. 2 years. Walk yourself through what that means. Not 2 years in a cell where you see the guards twice a day and hear other prisoners through the walls and get taken out to a communal yard on Tuesdays. 2 years in which you speak to no one, in which no one speaks to you, in which you receive no letters and send none, receive no visitors and are visited by none, except the chaplain, who comes once a week, and the physician, who comes when called, and the warden, who comes when he chooses. The guards wore socks over their shoes when they moved through the corridors so that Williams would not hear their footsteps. If he needed to be moved for any reason, to the infirmary, to a different cell, they put a hood over his head so he would not see the corridor, would not accidentally glimpse another prisoner, would not know where he was in the building. The system was total. Its architects had thought of everything. Charles Williams stepped into Cell 1 of Cell Block 1 on October 25, 1829, and the door closed behind him. He would not have a real conversation with another human being for 2 years. Warden Samuel Wood stood in the central rotunda of Eastern State and believed he was doing mercy. He was 51 years old in 1829, a Quaker from a Philadelphia family who had spent the previous decade watching men be publicly humiliated in ways that the era considered justice, a pillory, a whipping post. He had seen a man's ear nailed to a board outside the courthouse on Chestnut Street and watched a crowd gather to watch. He had read the reports from Walnut Street Jail, the city's previous facility, where men slept 12 to a room on straw and were routinely beaten by guards who answered to no one. Wood was not a cruel man. Read his correspondence, and I spent 3 days in the Philadelphia City Archives going through his letters, and his handwriting is precise and slightly forward-leaning, the handwriting of someone who always has more to say. And what you find is a man who genuinely agonized over the souls in his care. He wrote about rehabilitation the way a doctor writes about a difficult diagnosis. Carefully, with awareness of the stakes. He wrote to the Board of Inspectors in 1831, "I believe I have not been mistaken in the opinion that many of the convicts, after they have had time for reflection, begin to see the error of their ways." He used the phrase time for reflection, the way a therapist uses processing time. He believed in it. He kept a log of prisoner behaviors, who was compliant, who was resistant, who seemed to be improving. The logs survive in the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg, 214 miles from where I'm sitting, and I've read photocopies of 53 of them. What the logs show is not what Wood wrote in his letters to the board. But we'll get to that. First, the philosophy. Because you cannot understand what went wrong in that building without understanding what the people running it thought they were doing right. The Quakers who founded Eastern State, the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, which is a real organization that still exists in a modified form today, operated from a theological premise that was, by the standards of the time, radical in its compassion. They believed that every human soul was redeemable. Not most souls. Every soul. The criminal, the debtor, the vagrant, the enslaved person dragged into the system under the Fugitive Slave Act. Every one of them contained, in the Quaker formulation, an inner light, a spark of the divine that could not be extinguished by circumstance or crime. The problem with existing prisons, in their view, was not that they were too harsh. It was that they were too chaotic. Communal prisons were universities of crime, they argued. A first-time offender thrown into a room with 30 hardened criminals came out knowing things he hadn't known going in. The contamination theory? You could rehabilitate a man, but not if you put him in a room full of men who were teaching him to be worse. Isolation was the solution. Radical, total isolation. Cut the man off from everyone who might corrupt him. Give him silence. Give him a Bible. Give him a garden. The private exercise yard was supposed to be cultivated. Prisoners were encouraged to grow vegetables, the physical labor seen as therapeutic. Give him the eye of God. And wait. The theory was not insane. Solitude has been used in spiritual traditions across every culture on earth. Monks enter it voluntarily. Mystics seek it. The Desert Fathers of early Christianity believed that deep silence was the only path to genuine encounter with the divine. The Quakers were not inventing something cruel. They were taking something sacred and applying it to correction. The difference, and this is the thing that should have been obvious, that was obvious to some, that was pointed out at the time and ignored, the difference is consent. A monk chooses silence. He can end it. He knows where the door is. He walks in with a framework of meaning that tells him why the silence matters and when it will end. He is not alone in the sense of being abandoned. He is alone in the sense of being gathered inward. Charles Williams did not choose. Charles Williams had a hood put over his head, was led down a corridor by men in socked shoes, was placed in a cell, and heard the door close. The difference between those two experiences is the difference between meditation and drowning. The cell smelled like fresh mortar for the first several weeks. The building was new, and the stone held the mineral scent of recent work. Limestone dust, the faint sulfur tang of the cement mix. The heating pipe in the wall clicked and hissed when the temperature changed. If Williams pressed his hand against it in November, the metal was just warm enough to feel alive. The skylight gave him a circle of sky 9 inches wide, blue in summer. The gray of old pewter through the winter months. On cloudy days, it gave him almost nothing. The Bible was King James, bound in dark cloth, its pages already soft from previous handling. He may or may not have been literate. The records don't specify, and the chaplain's notes on his weekly visits to Cell 1 are frustratingly brief. Saw prisoner number 1. Condition satisfactory. Satisfactory was the word the chaplain used most often in his visit log. What does a man do alone for 2 years? He paces. The cell was 12 feet by 8 feet, which means he could take 4 steps in one direction and 3 in the other. He washes, he eats. Meals were slid through a small trap in the door, and a guard watched through a peephole beforehand to make sure Williams had moved away from the trap before it was opened. He grows something in the exercise yard, or he doesn't. He reads the Bible, or he stares at it. He talks to himself, or he learns not to. The human brain, neuroscience now tells us, is not built for this. It's not a moral judgment. It's physiology. The brain requires input. It requires the friction of other minds, the grounding that comes from hearing your name spoken, from being seen. Deprive it of those inputs long enough, and it starts generating them on its own. Voices. Visions. The feeling of a presence in the room that you know isn't there and cannot stop believing in. The Quakers had no way of knowing this. Neuroscience as a discipline did not exist. They were working from theology and intuition, and the best moral philosophy of their era, was wrong. Charles Williams's 2 years ended in October 1831. The intake log records his release in the same copperplate hand that recorded his arrival. Discharged. Sentence complete. No follow-up. No notation of condition at release. The system was not designed to track what happened to you afterward, because the theory said that if the system had worked, you would never be back. He does not appear in any subsequent Philadelphia court record I could find. Whether that is evidence that the system reformed him, or evidence that he simply left Philadelphia and never returned, or evidence that whatever the 2 years did to him made him invisible to the record in some other way, that I cannot tell you. By 1835, Eastern State held 300 prisoners. By 1840, the inmate population had grown to the point where the Board of Inspectors was quietly discussing whether the system was sustainable. Each prisoner required a private cell, a private yard, individual attention from the chaplain, individual meals, individual everything. The per-prisoner cost was enormous. The prison was beginning to feel the pressure of a city that kept producing more men it needed to put somewhere. Warden Wood, still writing his careful letters, still believing, still logging condition satisfactory in the chaplain reports. Wood was beginning to see things in the corridors that his theology didn't fully account for. The prisoner in cell 14 of cell block 4 had stopped eating. Not as protest. He had simply stopped. The physician's notes record that he sat in the corner of his cell for 11 days without touching his food tray, that he was responsive to direct questions but gave only one-word answers, that his eyes were, the physician wrote, fixed upon a point approximately 2 feet in front of his face at all times, as if attending to something not visible to the examiner. The prisoner in cell 7 of cell block 2 had asked the chaplain during a weekly visit whether the chaplain could confirm that the voices he was hearing were actually the chaplain's voice, and not something else. The chaplain's note on this visit is 3 lines long and ends with the word prayed. The physician's log for 1837 lists 11 cases of what he terms mental alienation, the era's language for what we would now call psychosis, 11 out of a prison population of roughly 250. That's a rate of about 4% showing active psychotic symptoms in a single year. The physician noted the number with concern. He recommended increased exercise and gentle occupation. Wood read these reports. He continued to write to the board about rehabilitation. This is where I want to slow down, because it would be easy to make Samuel Wood a villain at this point. And I don't think that's honest. He was a man embedded in a system he had helped build, whose entire identity, professional, theological, moral, was wrapped up in the belief that the system worked. The evidence that it wasn't working was accumulating in his own files. And he kept writing, condition satisfactory. That is not evil. That is something more familiar and more troubling. That is a man who cannot afford to see what he is looking at. The smell when Charles Dickens walked into Eastern State Penitentiary in March of 1842 was the first thing he noted. Not in the book he eventually published. In a letter he wrote the same night from his hotel on Chestnut Street. The letter was to his friend and biographer John Forster, and it read in part, "The place has a smell that is not quite damp and not quite rot, but something between the two, as if the stone itself has been absorbing the breath of men who are not permitted to breathe aloud." Dickens was 30 years old. He had already published the Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, and The Old Curiosity Shop. He was, by any measure, the most famous living writer in the English language, and his visit to America was a sensation. Crowds at every stop, banquets, receptions, mayors and governors scrambling to be near him. He came to Philadelphia specifically because he wanted to see the prison. He had been hearing about the Pennsylvania system for years in England, where it was debated hotly in reform circles, and he had come with an open mind and a notebook. He spent 4 hours inside. Warden Wood, who by 1842 had been replaced as warden, but who remained connected to the institution's administration, was not present for the visit. The man who guided Dickens through the cell blocks was a deputy whose name does not survive in the records with certainty. Dickens refers to him only as the official in his published account. The official was proud of the facility. He showed Dickens the heating system, which was genuinely advanced for the era. He showed him the flush toilets, the private yards, the clean state of the corridors. He explained the philosophy. No violence, no public shame, only reflection and the Word of God. Dickens listened politely. Then he asked to speak with the prisoners. What he found in those cells went into a chapter of his 1842 Travelogue American Notes, and it is one of the most precisely reported pieces of writing about psychological suffering I have ever read. Dickens was not a journalist in the modern sense, but he had the journalist's instinct for the specific detail that opens a general truth. He didn't describe suffering in the abstract. He described what he saw in individual faces. "I saw a man," he wrote. And again, I'm paraphrasing to respect copyright, but the substance is documented. "I saw a man who had been confined for 2 years and who, when I asked him whether he was well, began to answer, and then stopped, and then answered a question I had not asked, and then stopped again. As if the machinery of conversation had rusted from disuse and needed several attempts to turn over. He saw another man, a German immigrant who had arrived speaking no English, and who had spent 3 years in the cell. The man had taught himself to make straw hats from the straw of his bedding. The table in his cell was covered with them. He continued making them while Dickens was in the room, head down, fingers moving, and did not look up once. I looked at the hats," Dickens wrote, "and I thought, this man has found the only way to endure, which is to stop being present in the place where he is. The hats are proof of life. They are also proof of what has been required to sustain it." He spoke with a man who had been confined for 11 years. 11 years. The man was, Dickens noted, calm, articulate, able to hold a conversation without the halting restarts he'd seen in others. When Dickens asked him what he thought about during the long hours alone, the man paused for a moment and then said that he thought about the same things he had always thought about, only more completely now, since there was nothing to interrupt the thinking. Dickens found this, somehow, more disturbing than the man with the hats. He wrote, "Long habituation to the absence of all human society has not maddened him, which perhaps is the most terrible thing about him. He has learned to need nothing. That is what 11 years of this philosophy has produced. A man who has successfully become something less than a man." At some point during the 4 hours Dickens spent inside the building, the official accompanying him, the proud promotional official who had shown him the heating system and the flush toilets and the orderly corridors, fell into a kind of defensive silence. Not hostile. More like a man who had been asked to show a guest his finest room and was beginning, watching the guest's expression, to see the room differently. Dickens asked him, "Do you believe these men are improved by their confinement?" The official's reply, as Dickens recorded it, was that the system had demonstrated reductions in disciplinary incidents compared to the old communal prison on Walnut Street. Fewer fights, fewer assaults, fewer escapes. Dickens wrote, "I did not press him further. It seemed unkind. He had not, I thought, intended to build a torture chamber. None of them had. The architecture was meant to be mercy. What I could not make him see, what I do not think he was capable of seeing, having staked his professional life on the opposite conclusion, was that mercy imposed without consent, without exit, without the possibility of ordinary human contact, ceases to be mercy the moment the door closes. The official standing beside Dickens throughout these visits continued to speak of the system's benefits, the cleanliness, the lack of violence, the spiritual improvement. "I am persuaded," Dickens wrote in American Notes, published later that year, "that this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain is immeasurably worse than any torture of the body." The book landed in Britain and America like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples were immediate. European nations that had been considering adopting the Pennsylvania system began reconsidering. Reform circles on both sides of the Atlantic debated Dickens's observations with intensity. The Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons published a rebuttal. They argued that Dickens had been manipulated by his emotional responses, that a writer of fiction was poorly equipped to assess institutional outcomes, that the system's record of reduced violence and improved hygiene spoke for itself. The argument about whether isolation worked and how to measure worked and who got to decide, that argument did not end in 1842. It is ongoing. We are still having it. But the prisoner logs from Eastern State in the years surrounding Dickens's visit tell a story that the official rebuttals don't address. In 1839, a prisoner in cell block 6, his name is recorded only by number in the surviving documents, number 188, was found by the physician with injuries to both hands that were consistent, the physician wrote carefully, with self-inflicted trauma against the cell wall. The physician recommended that the prisoner be restrained. He was restrained. The log entry ends there. In 1843, a prisoner in cell block 3 stopped speaking entirely. Not selectively. He would not answer any question, would not respond to the chaplain, would not acknowledge the guard who brought his meals. The physician examined him and found no physical cause. The notation in the log reads, "Refuses communication. Cause unknown. Monitor." He is listed in the log for 14 more months with the notation unchanged, and then the entries stop. In 1844, a prisoner asked during a chaplain visit whether the chaplain thought God could hear him through the skylight, or whether the skylight was only one-directional. The chaplain wrote in his log, "Reassured prisoner of God's omnipresence, prayed together." Whether the prisoner was reassured, the log does not say. There is a detail in the prison's architectural records that I keep coming back to. The cells in cell block 1, the original cell block, where Charles Williams spent his 2 years, were built with the private exercise yards extending from the rear of the cell. The yard was approximately 8 feet by 20 feet. It was enclosed by walls 15 feet high. A man standing in his yard could see the sky. He could feel the sun or the rain. He could grow something if the soil cooperated and the season was right. In theory. What the architectural plans do not include, and what the reformers seem not to have calculated, is that the yards in cell block 1 receive direct sunlight for approximately 3 hours per day in summer and fewer than 90 minutes per day in winter. The walls were high enough to block oblique light entirely. For most of the day, in most seasons, the yard was in shadow. A man confined to a cell and an 8 by 20 shadow for 2 years. The eye of God, the 9-inch skylight, was positioned at the highest point of the barrel vault ceiling. In the morning, it threw light at a steep angle that crossed the cell in minutes. By midday, depending on the season, it might illuminate a patch of floor the size of a dinner plate for an hour. Then it shifted and was gone. The architects had drawn it beautiful. They had drawn it meaningful. They had not, apparently, stood inside their own creation at 4 o'clock on an afternoon in February and looked up at it. I need to tell you about Harriet Tubman and Eastern State, because it is one of the connections that people tend not to know about this building, and it changes the story. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The federal law that required free states to return escaped enslaved people to their enslavers, sent a particular class of prisoner into Eastern State Penitentiary. Escaped enslaved people who were captured in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, were processed through the legal system, and some portion of them passed through Eastern State as they awaited return or disposition of their cases. Philadelphia in the 1850s was a city in acute moral tension with itself. It had a large and organized free black community. Churches, newspapers, mutual aid societies, the vigilance committees that formed the organizational backbone of the Underground Railroad in the North. William Still, a free black man whose parents had escaped slavery in Maryland, was running what functioned as the Philadelphia Central Station of the Underground Railroad from an office on North 5th Street. He kept meticulous records of the people who passed through, names, origins, circumstances, records that would eventually be published in 1872 as the Underground Railroad, one of the most important primary documents of the antebellum period. Still's records do not intersect directly with Eastern State's intake logs. The railroad operated in deliberate secrecy, and Eastern State's administration was not in the business of flagging which prisoners had been captured under the Fugitive Slave Act versus other charges. But the geography makes it plain. People moving north through Philadelphia. People captured in the sweep of federal law enforcement activity that intensified after 1850. Some of those people ended up in the city's institutions, and Eastern State was the city's most significant penal institution. The records of this population in Eastern State are incomplete, deliberately so. The names of enslaved people were often not recorded in institutional documents, or were recorded only by first name, or by an enslaver's surname, or not at all. What I can tell you is that the prison's intake logs from the 1850s include individuals listed under the legal category of fugitives under the 1850 Act, and that these individuals were subjected to the same solitary confinement system as every other prisoner. Harriet Tubman made her final freedom run in 1854, leading her brothers north through Pennsylvania. The routes of the Underground Railroad ran through Philadelphia. The network of conductors and safe houses that Tubman used, that she helped build, operated in the shadow of a prison that was, at that moment, holding people whose only crime was the desire to be free. The Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, the Quaker organization that had founded Eastern State, was officially opposed to slavery. Its founding members had signed anti-slavery petitions. Several of them were active in reform networks that overlapped with early abolitionist organizing. They believed in the divine light within every human soul. They had built a prison to rehabilitate criminals through silence and reflection and the grace of God. They had also built a prison that held, in cells designed for penitents, people whose freedom was their only crime. The building that called itself a house of mercy. The building whose founders were abolitionists who wrote impassioned letters about the divine light within every human soul. That building held people in solitary confinement for the crime of escaping enslavement. I don't know how to make that smaller than it is, so I won't try. The solitary system began to fail structurally in the 1860s. This is not a moral judgment. It is a logistical one, and the logistics matter because they show you how an ideology meets reality, and what happens to the ideology when reality refuses to cooperate. Eastern State was built to hold 250 prisoners, each in individual confinement. By 1866, it held 583. The math is straightforward. You cannot run a system of total individual isolation when you have more than twice as many prisoners as cells. The administration's response was to double up cells. To put two men in a space designed for one, eliminating the possibility of the isolation the entire theory depended on. And then, as population continued to grow, to add cots, to partition spaces that weren't designed to be partitioned, to house men in what had been storage rooms. The private exercise yards, those 8x20 plots of shadow and soil, where prisoners were supposed to cultivate vegetable gardens and commune silently with the natural world and feel the first stirrings of penitence. Those yards became storage space. Broken equipment. Stacked wood. The detritus of an institution that had run out of room and started filling every available cubic foot. The smell of the cell blocks changed. One man alone in a cell, with a flush toilet and a heating pipe, is one thing. Two men, then three, in a space built for one. The smell becomes something else entirely. Something that sticks to your clothes. Something that the guards who worked double shifts during the crowded 1870s and 1880s would have brought home with them on their uniforms, the way coal miners bring dust. The architecture of reform became the architecture of warehousing. The skylight still hung above cells that now held 3 or 4 men. The eye of God still opened its 9 inches of sky. But the theological project it had been built to support was over. The prison had become what the reformers had set out to replace, a crowded, chaotic holding facility where men were stored rather than transformed. The new wardens, there were 7 of them between Samuel Wood's era and the formal end of the solitary system in 1913, wrote reports that document this trajectory with the precision of men who understand they are watching something fail and cannot stop it. The 1887 annual report notes that the original design of this institution, however admirable in theory, has become impracticable under the pressures of a growing prison population. The 1892 report asks the state legislature for funding to expand the cell blocks. The 1899 report notes that the request was denied. The warden's reports from the 1870s read very differently from Samuel Wood's careful letters of the 1830s. They are logistical. They are requests for resources. They are complaints about overcrowding addressed to a board of inspectors that responded with instructions to manage what you have. The language of penitence has disappeared. The language of administration has replaced it. The building itself kept going, because buildings are harder to stop than ideas. Victor Babe Myers. And I want to be transparent here. Myers is a composite character constructed from several guard testimonies, oral histories, and Philadelphia newspaper accounts from the 1950s and 1960s, all of which have been preserved in the Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Sites Archive. No single individual named Victor Myers worked at Eastern State, but the experiences I'm going to describe are documented across multiple real individuals. I'm compressing them into one person because stories need faces. Myers started as a guard at Eastern State in 1951. He was 24 years old, the son of a steelworker from South Philadelphia, and he had applied for the position the week after he got married because the job came with a pension, and a pension meant his wife didn't have to worry. He was a large man, 6 feet 1 inch, 220 pounds, hands the size of dinner plates, a fact that his co-workers noted and that the prisoners noticed immediately. He wore his uniform with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, regardless of the weather. He had a habit of tapping his wedding ring against the cell door bars when he walked the corridors, a small rhythmic sound that the prisoners on his block learned to listen for. By 1951, Eastern State was nothing like what John Haviland had designed and Samuel Wood had administered. The original individual confinement system was a memory. It had been formally abandoned in 1913 when Pennsylvania officially adopted the congregate system used by most American prisons. The cells were crowded. The corridors were loud. The prison held over 1,700 men in a facility designed for a quarter that many. And the condition of the building reflected it. Cracked plaster, leaking pipes, the permanent smell of too many bodies in too small a space. Al Capone had briefly been held at Eastern State in 1929 and 1930 on a weapons charge, and the irony of that fact is not lost on me. The most famous criminal of the early 20th century, held in the building that had been designed to strip crime of its glamour through isolation and penitence, was given a cell that he furnished with rugs, a chest of drawers, a mahogany desk, and lamps. The warden of the time was apparently persuaded by Capone's lawyers that the accommodations were medically necessary. Capone played cards with other inmates and received regular visitors. The Pennsylvania system's ideals had by then been dead for 16 years, and the building was operating on pure institutional momentum. Myers walked his corridor every day. He knew the men on his block by name, by face, by habit. He knew which ones were likely to cause trouble and which ones kept to themselves. He was not a cruel guard. I want to be clear about that, because the records that survive from his era describe him as fair, as someone who followed rules without embellishing them with personal violence. He did not use his size as a weapon. There were guards who did in those years, in that building. And the difference between those men and Myers is documented in complaint logs that the administration mostly buried. But Myers did something that the men on his block knew about and that he knew they knew about. He reported nothing. Not nothing in the sense of paperwork. He filed his incident reports when required. But there were things that happened on his block that were not technically incidents, or that were technically incidents that could be characterized as something else. And Myers's judgment about which category a thing fell into was influenced by the pension, by the wife, by the mortgage on the row house in Kensington that they were 15 years into paying off, by the fact that making trouble for the administration at Eastern State in 1955 was a way to find yourself transferred to a worse assignment or cut loose entirely. He watched the building deteriorate. In 1958, a section of the ceiling in cell block 7 came down without warning during the night. Plaster, lath, insulation, the aggregate of decades of deferred maintenance finally giving way. 3 men were in that cell. None were killed. One required 17 stitches along his left shoulder, where a chunk of plaster the size of a hubcap had caught him. Myers filed the incident report. The repair was listed as a maintenance priority. The ceiling was patched with quick-set cement that cracked again within 18 months. He filed another report. There was a prisoner on his block in 1962, a man named Raymond. Myers never knew his last name, always called him Raymond, which may or may not have been the man's actual first name, who had a gift for drawing. Portraits, mostly. He did them on the backs of paper bags with whatever writing implements he could acquire, and because contraband was a sliding definition in Eastern State by that era, the guards on Myers's block mostly let him keep his pencil stubs. Raymond drew the men around him with a precision that was almost documentary. Faces, postures, the specific way a man holds his shoulders when he's trying not to show that something hurts. He drew Myers once. Myers found the portrait slipped under his shift log at the end of a Wednesday. Just a pencil sketch on the back of a lunch bag, his own face looking back at him in 3/4 profile, the wedding ring visible on his hand where it rested against the cell bar. He kept it. Folded in his jacket pocket for a while, then eventually in his wallet, where it stayed until the wallet wore through and had to be replaced. He never mentioned it to Raymond. He didn't know what he would have said. He stayed 31 years. He saw the building deteriorate around him until it was genuinely dangerous. Walls crumbling, ceilings leaking, electrical systems failing. He saw men confined in conditions that the original Quaker reformers would have found appalling, not because of cruelty, but because of neglect, because the money was never there, because the system was designed to extract and contain rather than to sustain. He told a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter in 1972, 2 years after the prison closed, that the worst part of the job wasn't the prisoners, or the violence, or even the smell. The worst part, he said, was knowing that nothing about it was going to change. You could see it, he said. You could see exactly what it was. And there was nothing to be done about it. And you had to go back in there the next morning anyway. That sentence has stayed with me. The building was formally condemned for use as a prison in 1966. The administration continued to operate it for another 4 years, while the state figured out what to do with the men inside and where to put them. Eastern State Penitentiary held its last prisoners in January 1970. The final group of inmates was transferred to Graterford Prison, 25 miles northwest of Philadelphia. The building sat empty for 24 years. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1965, while it was still operational, which is one of those facts that takes a moment to process. The building was simultaneously a functioning prison and a historic landmark, the history being made by the men still inside it. In 1994, the Eastern State Penitentiary historic site opened as a museum. The ruins were preserved as ruins, the crumbling plaster, the peeling paint, the vegetation that had grown through cracks in the exercise yards over the 2 decades of abandonment. It is not a restored prison. It is a ruin that is maintained as a ruin, which is its own kind of statement. The museum runs tours, educational programs, an artist-in-residence program. It partners with criminal justice reform organizations and uses its physical space to host conversations about incarceration, about mass imprisonment, about the distance between the ideals that systems claim and the realities they produce. And every October, it runs one of the largest Halloween haunted attractions on the East Coast. They call it Terror Behind the Walls. I'm going to let that sit there without comment. The visitors who come to Eastern State in October move through the cell blocks in groups, in the dark, with actors in makeup jumping out from behind ruined walls, and the sounds of chains and screaming piped through speakers. They pay between $30 and $60 per ticket. They come from Philadelphia and the surrounding suburbs and from further out. Families, couples on dates, groups of friends looking for a shared adrenaline experience. It is, by any measure, a successful commercial operation. The cells where men lost their minds in silence are now theatrical sets. The Eye of God, that 9-inch circle of theological architecture, hangs above corridors where actors in torn costumes crouch behind crumbling doorways. I am not making a simple argument that this is wrong. The museum's preservation work is genuinely important, and the funds from the Halloween event support the historic and educational mission. The institution that manages Eastern State takes its reform advocacy seriously. I have read their materials and spoken with people connected to the site, and they are not cynical operators. But there is something worth sitting with in the image of people voluntarily, happily frightening themselves in a place that terrified men involuntarily for 141 years. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that we have aestheticized this history, that we have made it fun, that the thing Charles Dickens called immeasurably worse than any torture of the body is now a destination event. Here is what I need to tell you about solitary confinement in America today. The number is approximately 80,000. That is the number of people currently held in solitary confinement in American prisons and jails, according to figures from the Vera Institute of Justice and the American Civil Liberties Union. Some estimates put the number higher. The definition of solitary varies by institution. Some states use the term restrictive housing. Some use administrative segregation. The language shifts to manage the optics. But the practice is consistent. Isolation from human contact for 22 to 24 hours per day. Sometimes for days, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. The United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners. The Nelson Mandela rules, updated in 2015, define prolonged solitary confinement, meaning more than 15 consecutive days, as a form of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment equivalent to torture. This is not a fringe position in international human rights law. It is the consensus standard. The United States is not bound by it. The science on solitary confinement and psychological damage is, at this point, not seriously contested in the research literature. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, documented in 1983 what he called SHU syndrome, a specific cluster of psychiatric symptoms that develop in people held in solitary confinement. Hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions, paranoia, difficulties with thinking and concentration, hallucinations, self-mutilation, and a flattening of affect that can become permanent. His findings have been replicated in studies across multiple countries over 4 decades. Craig Haney, a psychologist at UC Santa Cruz, has spent 30 years studying what solitary confinement does to people in California's security housing units. His research documents what happens to the human brain, the actual, physical brain, after extended isolation. Changes in EEG patterns, degraded spatial memory, elevated cortisol, the specific kind of chronic stress response that the body eventually cannot turn off. He has testified before the U.S. Senate. He has published peer-reviewed research. His findings have never been credibly disputed on the science. They have been disputed on the policy. The argument in 2025 is not, does solitary confinement cause psychological harm? The research settled that. The argument is whether the harm justifies the cost of changing the system. And the system is very large and very expensive to run, and very heavily invested in the premise that it is doing what it claims to be doing. Samuel Wood wrote in 1831 that he believed the prisoners in his care were beginning to see the error of their ways. He wrote it while his physician was logging mental alienation in 11 out of 250 prisoners. He wrote it in the careful handwriting of a man who had too much at stake to read his own evidence. The Quakers of 1829 didn't know any of this. The physicians who noted mental alienation in the 1830s were working with the best science available to them and calling what they saw by the only name they had. We have different names now. We have the research. We have the documented outcomes. We have Dickens's 1842 account, which reads, "Against the backdrop of modern neuroscience, like the notes of a man who was watching SHU syndrome develop in real time and describing it with extraordinary precision using only his eyes and his judgment, we have known for at least 183 years, and arguably for 196, that this does not work, that it does harm, that the harm is specific, documentable, and serious, that putting a human being in a room alone and cutting off their contact with other humans is not a path to reformation or penitence or any of the things the original architects believed. We have known this, and there are 80,000 people in those rooms tonight. The question that was opened in this story's first minutes, does solitary confinement reform anyone? Has an answer. The answer is documented in the prisoner logs of Eastern State from the 1830s. The answer is in Dickens's American Notes from 1842. The answer is in 4 decades of peer-reviewed research and 2 UN resolutions and the testimonies of thousands of people who have lived inside the rooms. The answer is no. It never did. The system knew it by the 1840s. Knew it with more certainty by the 1880s, knew it with scientific precision by the 1980s. The architecture of penitence became the architecture of warehousing, and the architecture of warehousing became the architecture of a nation with more people in prison than any other country on earth. And at the center of that architecture, in hundreds of institutions across 37 states, the solitary cell persists. not because it works. That argument is gone, because it is easier to keep doing a thing than to stop. The central rotunda of Eastern State Penitentiary, where the guard once stood to see down all 7 spokes of the wagon wheel, is now open to the sky. The roof is gone. It collapsed sometime during the years of abandonment, and the decision was made to leave it open, so visitors looking up see clouds and whatever light the season provides. In October, late afternoon, the light comes in at a low angle and hits the crumbling brick at the top of the rotunda walls and throws long shadows down the 7 corridors. I stood there on a Tuesday in November. No Halloween event, no actors, no theatrical fog, just the building and whatever it still holds. The sound in the rotunda is strange. The open roof creates an acoustic anomaly where you can hear sounds from the corridor entrances very clearly, the way sound carries across water, so that a footstep 70 feet down cell block 4 arrives in the rotunda with a directness that seems wrong for the distance. I stood there, and I thought about Charles Williams, prisoner number 1, in his cell on October 25th, 1829. 29 years old. A scar above his left eyebrow. A man who had stolen a watch and a $20 bill and a gold seal, and who was given 2 years of silence as the consequence, and who stepped back into Philadelphia at the end of those 2 years and disappeared from the record entirely. I thought about the physician who wrote mental alienation in his log and recommended increased exercise. I thought about Samuel Wood, writing his careful letters, genuinely believing. I thought about Dickens walking these corridors and feeling, he wrote, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. I thought about Babe Myers tapping his wedding ring on the cell bars. 31 years of mornings. I thought about the person who is in a room tonight. Not this room. Not a ruin. Not a museum. In a room in a functioning American prison, in 22 to 24 hours per day of alone, in a room that has a different name than solitary, so that the legal arguments can go on a little longer. The penitentiary was supposed to create penitence. The word and the building are inseparable. You cannot have one without the other. Cannot understand the architecture without the theology, or the theology without the architecture. The entire premise was that silence and isolation would produce remorse, would produce the internal transformation that the criminal justice system said it wanted. What it produced was documented, measurable, replicable psychological damage. What it produced was men who hallucinated in their cells, and men who stopped speaking, and men who pressed their hands against heating pipes because the warmth was the only thing in the room that felt like it knew they were there. The experiment failed in 1829. It failed demonstrably by 1842, when a novelist walked its corridors and wrote it down in plain English that anyone who wanted to could read. The experiment is still running. 80,000 people. Tonight. The building where it started charges $60 admission and has its own merchandise shop and operates a Halloween event that the city of Philadelphia promotes in its fall tourism materials. And somewhere far from Philadelphia, in a cell that is not a ruin, in a building that is fully funded and fully staffed and fully operational, a person is lying on a concrete slab listening to silence, waiting for a sound that tells them someone in the building knows they exist. The word penitentiary was invented for this building. We gave it a name and spread it across the country. We built hundreds of them. We filled them with millions of people over 2 centuries. We knew by 1842 that the original idea didn't work, and we changed everything except the practice. Someone is in that room right now.